I showed up unexpectedly at the company's special party and saw a strange man kiss my wife, and in that instant, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. There was no scream, just a silence that said it all. I left without saying goodbye, ending a story she had already betrayed. "I didn't expect you to come," she said later, but it was too late. Time passed, and while she discovered her lover didn't want a commitment, I found peace with a new love, one who knows the value of loyalty. Alone, she tried to get back together, overcome with regret. I listened, looked into her eyes, and offered what I still had left, forgiveness. Not to return, but so that each of us could move forward in peace, albeit on different paths. The worst part wasn't seeing it. It was feeling it. It was realizing that the embrace that awaited me was no longer mine. The smile that, for years, had belonged to me, was now offered to another man, as if our time together were just a sketch, a poorly drafted draft of what she now called life. My heart didn't shatter into noisy pieces. It dissolved silently, like wet paper, sinking into the shame of having loved someone who no longer existed. She didn't turn around. She didn't even notice. He remained there, as if nothing were out of place, his arms wrapped around another body, his lips pressed against those of a man I'd never seen before. And I stood there, like an expendable extra in the very story I'd dedicatedly written. You didn't see me arrive. You didn't notice my presence. Or, perhaps, you noticed and pretended. The silence that greeted me that night was more honest than any word spoken in the last few months. I walked away amid smiles that didn't belong to me, toasts that no longer included me, and gazes that avoided my gaze. No one said anything. No one did anything. And there, in that brightly lit room, surrounded by people, I discovered what it was like to be completely alone. The noise of the party swallowed the sound of my soul falling, like glass on marble. When I got home, I didn't cry. I didn't sleep either. I stood there, staring at a picture frame on the shelf, remembering our first trip together, the nights she'd hug me from behind, telling me the world could end there. And, in a way, it really did. But not like she said, not with kisses and promises. It ended with a betrayal with no return, with the touch of other lips stealing what was mine. The next day, she arrived, laughing. Her eyes held the sparkle of someone who had experienced something intense. I knew it. It was the sparkle she had once brought to me. And when she saw me sitting on the couch, still in my party clothes, because I didn't even have the strength to change, she stopped. The laughter died on her lips. "Did you go?" she asked, as if stumbling upon an inconvenient truth. "I didn't expect you to come." I didn't answer. There was nothing more to say. I got up, grabbed my car keys, and left. I didn't slam the door. I didn't break anything. I simply left behind the life that no longer belonged to me. The following days were a series of absences. I was there, but I wasn't. I worked on autopilot, ate without tasting it, slept out of exhaustion, not rest. She tried to pretend nothing had happened, and for a while, she avoided me, as if my presence betrayed the guilt she didn't want to carry. But guilt, unlike pain, has a sound. It scratches inside. And she began to change. She tried to talk, brought flowers, cooked dinners. But it wasn't out of love. It was out of fear. Fear of having destroyed something that, until then, she believed would last forever. But forever, in our case, lasted until the moment she allowed another mouth to occupy the space of mine. Time passed. Slowly. And while she lost herself in empty justifications and selective memories, I rediscovered pieces of myself in the places I'd always avoided. I walked alone through the park again, listening to the songs that reminded me of what it meant to be whole. And it was there, in the simplicity of a hot coffee and light conversation, that I met someone who didn't want to fix me, they just wanted to walk beside me. Someone who didn't ask about the past, but was interested in who I was now. And in that undemanding gaze, I found peace. Not euphoria, nor promises. But peace. And peace, after what I'd been through, was the greatest gift. Meanwhile, reality began to knock on the door of the woman who once swore to love me. Her lover disappeared. He didn't want labels, commitments, or a future. She tried to hold on to him with promises, with dinners, with words that had already been said to me. But nothing worked. Because those who cheat to live a story forget which stories end, and not always well. And so, she was left with the silence she ignored that night. Alone, surrounded by memories that now hurt. You tried to call me. You sent messages. He said it had been a mistake. That he still loved me. That I wanted to try again. But love, when broken so badly, cannot be mended. It bleeds dry. One day, she ran into me by chance. I was with the new woman beside me, walking calmly, laughing at something simple. And when our eyes met, there was no anger. No pain. Just an absence. She tried to smile, but the smile died before it could be born. And I simply nodded, out of respect for what had once been. Later, she sent a final message. She said she still dreamed of me. That she had lost much more than she imagined. That she now understood the value of loyalty. And she asked if I would forgive her. I responded calmly. I said yes. That I forgave. Not to go back. But to move on. Because holding a grudge is carrying a pain that only hurts the one who feels it. And I no longer wanted to carry anything that reminded me of the pain. I was a different person now. A man who learned, in the darkest moment, to rebuild himself with dignity. And she was the same. Only alone. And that night, before going to sleep, for the first time in a long time, I took a deep breath and slept peacefully. With another body by my side, another soul sharing my pillow. A new love, built on the foundation that betrayal had destroyed, respect. But what she never knew, and perhaps never will, is what really happened that night after I left the party. The choice I made, the place I went, the conversation I had. It was there that everything changed. It was there that what would come next began to be written. Because there is always an invisible moment where love dies, and another where healing begins. And what she doesn't imagine, is who I met that night. Or what they said to me. Because it was there that, without knowing it, she lost everything. Welcome to the channel. Here, we neither romanticize nor condone any kind of betrayal. The stories you'll hear are fictional, but they carry profound truths, to show, without filtering, how betrayal can destroy loves, homes, and entire lives. Brace yourself. What's coming next is intense, painful, and unforgettable. A shocking story is about to begin. His name was Daniel, and she was Laura. A couple who, for years, seemed to be the closest definition of emotional stability, complicity, and sincere love. Their story didn't begin with overwhelming passions, but with curious glances and a connection that grew over time, slowly, like all true things. They met at a professional training course, and their first dates were discreet, filled with conversations about work, books, and music. He was the kind of man who looked into her eyes while speaking, who listened more than he spoke, who cared about small details like the temperature of her coffee or the shortest route to get her home. She, on the other hand, was intense, cheerful, and full of an energy that lit up any room she entered. The combination seemed unlikely at first glance, but it was precisely this difference in rhythm that made them complete each other. As the months passed, their meetings became more frequent, the topics more intimate, the gestures more natural. Daniel began to notice how Laura tied her hair back when concentrating, and she, in turn, enjoyed watching his frown when trying to solve something complex. When he proposed to Laura, he didn't do it with a show, but with a simple note left in the middle of the book she was reading. She said yes with teary eyes, holding the paper as if it were an old love letter. It wasn't long before they were sharing the same roof. They rented a small but cozy apartment with hand-picked furniture, each one carrying a story or a whim of theirs. The bookshelf in the living room was dominated by her books, but the picture frames held the photos he loved to take on short weekend trips. Their life wasn't perfect, but it was harmonious. Laura worked in digital marketing at a mid-sized company, while Daniel was a project manager at a multinational. Their schedules often clashed, but they created rituals to keep their bond alive. Wednesdays were reserved for dinner he cooked, even if it was simple pasta with cheap wine. Sundays invariably began with breakfast in bed, prepared by her, with crooked pancakes and fruit cut haphazardly. Every gesture was a reminder that love is also about routine, not just intensity. In the eyes of friends, colleagues, and even family, they were a model couple. The kind of couple they rely on for advice at birthday parties or Sunday brunches. Daniel was considered the ideal partner, stable, hardworking, and attentive. Laura, in turn, was seen as the woman who balanced freedom and care well, who knew how to be strong without losing her delicacy. Neither of them liked to expose their relationship on social media, but when they did post something together, it was always spontaneous, not on set dates. That said a lot about how they experienced love, truthfully, without the need to prove anything to anyone. Despite so much affection, there was something subtle in the air that, over time, began to change. It wasn't a fight, nor a lack of affection. It was more like a change of tune. The silences between one topic and another began to lengthen. Dinners became quieter, not out of anger, but out of distraction. Both were increasingly absorbed by the demands of work. Laura began traveling frequently to oversee projects in other cities. Daniel, pressured by company deadlines, spent more hours at the office. When they were together, fatigue spoke louder than the desire to talk. Even so, there was effort. Daniel tried to keep the surprises going. Once, he left notes scattered around the house with little compliments, just for her to find throughout the day. Laura, upon noticing the gesture, bought tickets to a play he'd mentioned months earlier, even though she wasn't much of a theater fan. The gestures were there, but they seemed to no longer have the same effect. There was a weariness that couldn't be named, but it was felt in the details. They still slept in each other's arms, but less often. They still kissed, but sometimes out of habit. The intimacy endured, but sometimes seemed to hide behind routine. At the company where she worked, Laura was well regarded. She had a strong presence, was creative, and, above all, confident. She was often placed at the forefront of presentations and strategic projects. Daniel was always proud of this, and said, without reservation, that she deserved every achievement. There was never any overt jealousy between them. He trusted her. And she, as far as anyone could tell, trusted him too. But the days began to weigh unevenly. Daniel missed the lightness of before. He began to silently question whether Laura was still happy with him, or if the woman he knew had changed, or perhaps he was the one left behind. In conversations with friends, Daniel was the kind of man who didn't reveal the problems in his relationship. He preferred to keep what troubled him to himself. He felt protective, perhaps even denial, that their love was strong enough to withstand time, boredom, and change. Laura, on the other hand, had always been more communicative with her friends. Sometimes she'd let it slip that she missed feeling desired. Not necessarily by other men, but by him. She missed the times when he'd look at her hungrily in the eyes, when he'd text her in the middle of the workday just to say he missed her. The messages now were more about, "Don't forget to stop by the grocery store," or "I'll be late today." Practical things. Things that slowly kill the emotional. Despite this, no one spoke of separation. There was love. Or something that still mingled with it. Maybe it was attachment, maybe it was the history they'd built. 10 years of relationship can't be discarded like a broken glass. There's furniture, joint accounts, a network of mutual friends, even future plans, albeit undefined ones. And then there was their little daughter, 7 years old, who slept between them on Sundays and drew pictures of the three of them holding hands. It was for her that they tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, even when their hearts seemed to beat at different rhythms. The girl was sweet, affectionate, and saw in her parents what every child should see, security. And then came the invitation to the company party where Laura worked. A traditional, more upscale event, designed to recognize the year's highlights. She mentioned it to Daniel neutrally, as if she didn't expect him to attend, nor that he cared. He, already more introspective, simply said he'd try to show up, depending on his commitments. It wasn't a promise. It was another one of those phrases thrown around to avoid contradiction. She didn't insist. He didn't confirm. It hung in the air, like so many other things between them. That week, Daniel had important conversations at work, exhausting meetings, and sleepless nights. But at some point, perhaps seeing a drawing of his daughter with her father and mother smiling, something made him want to go. To show up. To be present. Maybe to surprise her, maybe to break out of his rut. He chose a new shirt, put on some perfume, and went. Without warning. He arrived at the event without great expectations, perhaps even hoping to rediscover in her that sparkle he felt was fading. He didn't bring a gift, nor flowers. He brought only his heart, still willing, still open. Still believing there was an us. But even before he found her, even before any warm reunion, something inside him began to shift. The conversations around him sounded different. The laughter in the air seemed more distant. And when his eyes finally found hers, everything changed. Not because she saw him. But because, in that moment, she didn't. And even without realizing it, that night left its mark. Not in the form of words or confrontations. But in what was kept hidden, in what was seen and unsaid. The silence that would follow would be deafening. But the exact moment was yet to come. And with it, the truth. But for now, there was still time. Time to observe. To try to understand. To, perhaps, forgive. But what Daniel never imagined was that this would be the beginning of the end. An end that wouldn't come with screams, nor with goodbyes. But with the slow death of a love he believed to be eternal. That night, Daniel parked his car a few meters from the party venue. He was well dressed, but with a neutral expression, perhaps slightly tired, carrying in his eyes the kind of expectation born in silence, when one simply wants to belong again to something that has gradually slipped through the cracks of routine. He had chosen not to announce he was going. He wanted to surprise her. Maybe rekindle something. Maybe just observe. It wasn't a rehearsed decision, nor a planned one. It was an impulse born of the desire to be present, to reclaim a ground he felt was disappearing without anyone noticing. He took a deep breath before entering, straightened his shirt collar, and crossed the threshold of the party hall. The lights were low, the music hand-picked, the faces too smiling for him to feel truly comfortable. But he moved forward, discreetly, trying to locate her amidst the decorated tables and the conversations that echoed with the lightness typical of environments where no one carries a heavy heart. He spent a few minutes walking among the groups, searching Laura's face. For a moment, he felt ridiculous for being there without being sure he would be welcome, but something inside him held him steady, as if some still innocent part insisted on believing that simple gestures could still mean so much. And then, across the room, he saw her. Laura was beautiful. She wore an elegant dress, a deep blue that highlighted her fair skin and lively eyes. She was smiling. A wide, genuine, almost nostalgic smile. For a brief moment, Daniel stood there, just watching. And then, everything changed. Her smile wasn't for him. Her light laughter wasn't for him. The sparkle in her eyes, the one he knew so well, now belonged to someone else. She was with a man. Tall, well-dressed, with a confident posture. Daniel didn't know him, but he didn't need an introduction to understand what was happening. He saw her place her hand on his shoulder intimately, then lean in to whisper something in his ear. Time slowed. And then, he saw it. The kiss. Not a disguised peck, not a misinterpreted gesture. A full, lingering, comfortable kiss. The kind of kiss only given when there's a real connection. Laura seemed oblivious to her surroundings. Surrendered. Happy. As if nothing else mattered. As if there wasn't a home waiting for her. As if Daniel were already just a memory. He didn't move. He stood there, motionless, as if his body had forgotten how to react. No expression. No tears. Just the immobility of someone whose soul had been crushed in an instant. The party went on. The lights continued to dance over the wine glasses, the conversations continued to flow, the laughter pierced the air as if nothing were wrong. But inside, everything was in ruins. He turned slowly, crossed the room silently, ignored by everyone, and left through the same door he'd entered. Outside, the night was cold. The air seemed denser. In the car seat, it took a few minutes to start the engine. The silence inside was absolute, broken only by a pent-up, almost painful breath. He didn't cry. Not yet. He felt no anger, no hatred. He felt only a profound emptiness. As if a part of him had been ripped out without anesthesia. In the days that followed, Laura continued to act normally. When she got home that night, she was more relaxed than usual. She said the party had been fun, mentioned something about the buffet, and went upstairs to take a shower. Daniel watched her as she spoke, and for the first time, he didn't hear anything. His thoughts were elsewhere. On the image of her with another man, on the kiss that had destroyed him inside. But still, he said nothing. He preferred silence. Not out of cowardice, but because he didn't know what to do with it all. How do you confront someone you still love? How do you get answers to questions you dread hearing? For the next few days, Laura carried on as if nothing had happened. He saw her leaving for work, packing her daughter's backpack, smiling on video calls with colleagues. Everything seemed the same, but it wasn't. Daniel began to live in a kind of trance, between the past he wanted to reclaim and the present that imposed itself like a quiet nightmare. Sometimes he watched her sleep and wondered when exactly she had started to leave. Because it wasn't that night. It was before. Much earlier. And he didn't see it. Or didn't want to see it. One morning, while they were having coffee, she asked why he'd been so quiet. He replied that he was just tired. She nodded, not pushing. Perhaps relieved he hadn't asked anything. Perhaps guilty to know the reason for his silence. Or perhaps simply indifferent. Daniel began to notice details he'd previously ignored. The face-down phone. The laughter during text messages. The vague excuses for being late. But everything was done carefully, like someone who doesn't want to be caught. Or like someone who's given up hiding because they believe the other person won't react. The moments of tenderness became increasingly rare. The kisses, the hugs, the lingering glances, all of this dissolved into everyday life. There were still family dinners, visits with grandparents, smiles and photos, but everything felt staged. Daniel now carried the weight of knowledge, and with it, helplessness. He didn't want to fight, he didn't want to expose the pain. He wanted to understand. He wanted to know why. When you lose someone through fate, there is mourning. When you lose someone through betrayal, there is a living death, an absence that breathes alongside, that shares the bed, that shares the bathroom. And this absence is cruel. His daughter, still innocent, continued to bring light to his days. It was with her that Daniel recharged his strength. The moments with her were the only ones that still held true. Laura seemed to keep up appearances, but he noticed how she avoided eye contact, as if a part of her knew that, at some point, she would be confronted. But he put off that moment. Perhaps for fear of confirming that what he saw was real. Perhaps because he still hoped it was all just a misunderstanding. The pain of doubt was unbearable, but the fear of confirmation was greater. The next night, she received a text and smiled. Daniel was on the couch, reading a book, but he noticed. She tried to hide it. She said she was a friend from work, that they were planning something for the week. He didn't respond. He just watched. And there, for the first time, he felt anger. Not at the betrayal itself, but at the coldness. At the way she carried on so naturally, as if he were an extra who didn't even deserve an apology. The image of the kiss at that party came back to him with a vengeance. The intimate gesture. The familiar touch. He relived it every night, like self-imposed torture. He didn't know what he would do yet, but something in him had already changed. A few days later, while sorting through old documents in his room, he found an old card she had written on one of their wedding anniversaries. It was simple, with rounded letters, and said how happy she was with him. How safe he made her feel. Daniel held the paper for a few minutes, unable to react. A piece of memory trying to survive inside a gift that no longer held any promise. He put the card back in the box, carefully closed it, and put it back on the shelf. In that moment, he decided he needed an answer. The next morning, as she was getting ready to leave, he called her over. He asked her to sit down. Laura hesitated, but then sat down. The atmosphere was tense. He calmly asked if there was anything she wanted to say. She nervously denied it, asking why he was asking. He was silent for a few seconds. He said he knew. That he saw. That it wasn't an assumption. That it wasn't suspicion. She turned pale. She tried to deny it, but Daniel's expression was definitive. There was no room for lies. And there, faced with the weight of the truth, she gave in. He said it was a mistake. That it meant nothing. That she was confused. He just listened. He didn't shout. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. When it was over, Laura tried to touch him. She said she still loved him. That it was an impulse. That things between them were difficult. But Daniel didn't respond. He got up, went to his room, and closed the door. She stood there, in the living room, her hands on her face, crying softly. For the first time, her pain seemed real. But for him, it was too late. The betrayal had a bitter taste that couldn't be erased with tears. It wasn't the kiss that hurt. It was what it meant. It was everything they had built being thrown away by a moment that, according to her, meant nothing. And that was precisely what hurt, the fact that everything they had could be destroyed by something so small, so empty. Silence settled in permanently. In the following days, they shared the same space, but not the same time. Their conversations focused solely on their daughter, school, and the basics. Daniel didn't ask any more questions. And Laura didn't insist. But something still needed to be said. Something she was still hiding. A detail that could change everything. And what Daniel didn't know, was that this detail was closer than he imagined. It was a typical afternoon when the message arrived. Daniel was in his makeshift home office, reviewing some reports, trying to keep his mind occupied, trying to avoid the memories of the cold conversation, the disconnected confession of regret. The betrayal was already an open wound, but the silence that followed was even more corrosive. Laura, since then, had been restrained, careful in her gestures, searching for ways to make subtle connections that he no longer allowed. The days passed at a strange pace, the routine held together like a facade hastily erected after an earthquake, but inside, nothing was in order. And then, there, among folders and charts, the notification on his phone broke the torpor. A short, direct message from a former colleague of Laura's whom he barely knew: "You deserve to know the truth. She wasn't just disloyal to you." His heart raced, not with anger, but with intuition. There was something else. Something he didn't know, something that perhaps explained the emptiness in Laura's gaze even after the confession. He tried to ignore it. He tried to convince himself that it was enough, that he didn't need anything more. But curiosity ached like splinters under his skin. He responded cautiously. The woman asked to meet in person. She said it was serious, that it wasn't something to be said over text. She scheduled the meeting for late afternoon, at a discreet cafe outside the city center. Daniel arrived with a mixture of coldness and distrust. He sat down, ordered a coffee he didn't drink, and waited. The woman arrived with a tense expression, as if carrying an old weight. She said she didn't want to get involved, but that she'd been holding it in for months and couldn't keep it a secret any longer. And then he began to tell her. Laura's lover wasn't just a fling. He was someone she'd been intimate with even before the party, someone who worked with her, and, above all, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. But what hurt Daniel most wasn't discovering that the relationship had lasted longer than he'd imagined, nor that the encounters were frequent, nor that he'd been deceived for longer than he'd thought. What broke something inside him was learning that, months before the party, Laura had received an offer, a transfer to work in another city, something she'd always dreamed of, a promotion that came with prestige, a raise, and status. But she refused. He refused not to be with his family. She refused because the man she'd become involved with didn't want to date a distant woman. She refused to keep alive the possibility of something with him. Daniel couldn't hide the shock. The coffee in his cup trembled in his hands. The woman, upon noticing, said she thought he already knew, that Laura had probably told him. He shook his head, once, twice. His heart pounded in his ears. He stood, thanked her for telling him, and left without saying goodbye. The air outside felt thin. It was as if he were swallowing sand. The betrayal, which had previously been a poison difficult to bear, was now accompanied by a conscious choice. She didn't just get involved with another man. She made plans. She chose. She gave up an important professional opportunity for someone who wouldn't accept it. And, silently, she kept Daniel by her side as a backup pillar, a comfort zone in case the new thing didn't work out. He arrived home without saying a word. He found Laura in the kitchen, preparing something for dinner. She smiled tensely when she saw him, as if still waiting for a sign of reconciliation. He watched her for a few seconds in silence, then asked her to sit down. She put down her cutlery, wiped her hands, and looked at him seriously. There was something in his eyes she didn't recognize. Something that mixed fatigue, hurt, and a dangerous firmness. He asked, in a low but firm voice, if she'd turned down the transfer offer because of the man she'd cheated on him with. She froze. She hadn't expected it. There was no way she could lie anymore. She swallowed hard, tried to find the words, but none seemed right. She simply said that things had gotten confusing, that she was in a vulnerable moment, that she felt invisible at home. Daniel interrupted. He said he didn't need an excuse. He just wanted to know if it was true. And she nodded. Quietly, almost in a whisper, her eyes full. She said yes. That she refused. That she believed perhaps that man was someone who would bring her something new, something that had been lost between her and Daniel. She said she'd felt guilty ever since. That she didn't know how to fix it. She thought about telling him, but was afraid. That she hoped time would make her forget everything. He listened, impassive. But inside, every word was a blade. When she finished, she tried to touch him, but he pulled away. He said that what hurt him most wasn't the kiss, nor the surrender of her body, but the choice. The decision to sacrifice something for another man, while continuing to share his bed, his table, his life. He said that, in that moment, she killed him without realizing it. Not with words, not with screams, but with silent actions that left wounds that might never heal. Laura began to cry, saying she regretted it, that she now realized how much she had lost, that what she thought was new and exciting had turned out to be empty and superficial. She said the other man never wanted anything serious, that he left as soon as he realized she wanted something more. That everything fell apart. Daniel stood up, walked to the door, turned to her, and told her he was no longer angry. He said that love, when betrayed and denied for long enough, dies. And that he deeply regretted it. Not for her, but for everything they could have been. He said he now understood that the end doesn't always come with storms, but sometimes with prolonged silences. And that she chose silence. He left, and for the first time, he didn't look back. In the room, his daughter slept peacefully, oblivious to what was happening. Daniel watched her for a moment, stroked her hair, and there, he found the only reason that kept him going. The following days were spent reorganizing. Picking up the pieces. Daniel began sleeping in his daughter's room and, little by little, began looking for alternatives. He spoke with a lawyer. He began the divorce proceedings. Laura tried to argue, tried to delay, but there was no more room. Not after everything. He, on the other hand, had already begun rebuilding. Carefully, calmly, with dignity. There was no rush. But there was also no more illusion. And there was still something she didn't know. Something Daniel kept hidden with unsettling calm. A detail that would change everything. And that detail was about to be revealed. Daniel didn't return home that night. After putting his daughter to bed, he left silently, without explanation, without a gesture that betrayed anger or pain. The city was cold, the wind cutting through the dimly lit streets, and he walked as if searching for a space within himself where he could pour out all that was left. There was no more conflict, at least not the loud, explosive kind. There was only a complete emptiness. A strange clarity that only comes when the loss is definitive. He walked to the building where his sister lived, rang the intercom, and asked to sleep there that night. She didn't ask any questions. She simply opened the door. He slept on the couch with a thin blanket and an immeasurable weight on his chest, but even so, he had the most peaceful sleep in weeks. The next morning, he texted Laura, informing her he would be away for a few days. He asked her to schedule a time to talk about the separation, custody of their daughter, and next steps. She responded with a simple, "Okay." It was clear, even from her cold words, that her resistance was fading, that hope was waning. Meanwhile, Daniel began to experience different days. She used the time away to reflect on everything, but also to allow herself to breathe fresh air. I walked places I usually avoided, visited bookstores, and had long coffees. Until, one of those days, I met someone again. Her name was Helena. They had met years ago through a mutual friend, but they had never had the chance to talk in depth. She was a psychologist who worked with vulnerable adolescents, and she had a serenity in her eyes that disarmed even the most bitter silence. Their reunion happened by chance, in a downtown bookstore. They exchanged a few words, shy smiles, and ended up sharing a table at the cafe next door. The conversation flowed with a naturalness Daniel hadn't expected. She didn't ask invasive questions, but she listened actively, a calm way of responding that made him feel he could open up. And for the first time since everything happened, he spoke, not to vent, but to listen to himself. Over the following weeks, they met a few more times. Never with the intention of anything happening. There was no rush. There was respect for time. But little by little, Helena became a refuge. A safe place. And Daniel began to realize there was life beyond pain. That there were people who knew how to care without suffocating, listen without judging, and love without promising what they couldn't deliver. Meanwhile, Laura remained trapped in a cycle of guilt and denial. She tried to stay functional, but she had lost control. The nights alone became too long, and the emptiness she had always attributed to routine was now completely different. It was a real, concrete absence. It was the end. He tried sending messages, suggesting dinners, meeting up to talk calmly. Daniel politely declined, focusing only on what was necessary. His mind was made up. There was no longer room for rebuilding. The marriage had ended long before the betrayal. The betrayal only served to highlight how corroded everything had become. And then, one random Saturday, Laura asked to talk in person. She said it was about their daughter, but Daniel knew there was more to it. He arranged to meet at the park where they usually took their daughter to play. He chose an open, airy place, where there would be no room for scenes or speeches that would force a reconciliation. When she arrived, she seemed different. She was dressed more simply, and her eyes, always restless, now carried a weight he recognized from afar, the weight of someone who finally understood what she had lost. They sat on a bench under the shade of a tree. She began talking about practical matters, as he expected, but her voice was shaky. And then, after a few minutes, her tone changed. She took a deep breath and said she needed to apologize. Not only for the betrayal, but for everything that preceded it. She said she now understood how far she had drifted, how much she had begun to look to others for what she should have built with him. She cried. And, between sobs, she confessed that she felt lost, directionless, and grounded. Daniel listened attentively. Not to foster any hope in her, but because he still had respect. When she finished, he said he forgave her. Not because she deserved it, but because he needed it to move forward with ease. He said he held on to good memories, that he valued their history, but that he was a different man now. And that he no longer fit into the space she had placed him in. He said this firmly, but gently. She cried more. She asked them to try again. For him to at least think about it. He responded with the calm of someone who no longer has any doubts. He said he was already in another stage of life. And that he had even met someone. Laura fell silent. The impact of those words fell like a dull blow. Her mouth parted, but no words came out. Her face drained of color for a moment. She asked who she was, where he'd met her. Daniel didn't answer in detail. He simply said she was an incredible woman. Someone who listened to him. Who saw him. And who made him feel at peace. He said he didn't know what the future held, but that, for the first time in a long time, he felt exactly where he was supposed to be. The silence between them stretched. Laura stood up and said she had to go. She said she wanted him to be happy. And before turning away, she said something he would never forget: "You were the best I ever had. And I only realized it when it was too late." Daniel watched her walk away without responding. Not out of contempt, but because nothing more needed to be said. Time, which so often serves to wear away, can also have the power to heal. Months passed. The divorce was finalized. Custody of their daughter was shared, with respectful agreements and a mutual care that, despite everything, remained intact when it came to the child. Daniel and Helena continued to get to know each other. Unhurriedly, but intensely. He relearned the meaning of sharing, of building something new based on truth, not necessity. She, in turn, showed him that love wasn't about filling voids, but about overflowing silently, in the details, in the small choices. Laura, on the other hand, faced a profound internal process. She began therapy and distanced herself from environments and people that kept her trapped in toxic cycles. She tried to start over, but a shadow haunted her, the knowledge of having destroyed something that could have been eternal. This wasn't punishment. It was learning. And despite the pain, she knew she had to face it alone. One December evening, Daniel and Helena walked together with their daughter through a Christmas market. The lights, the music, the scent of cinnamon in the air, everything tasted new. The girl held each of their hands and laughed loudly as she pointed at the decorations. Daniel looked at Helena and, without saying anything, lightly squeezed her fingers. She smiled back, and in that gesture, there was more meaning than any declaration. This was where he wanted to be. This was where, finally, he was whole. And even though a part of the past still lived within him, he was now at peace. Because what he lost was never love. It was merely the illusion of a love that had already ended. And what Laura never knew, what Daniel never told her, was that night he left the party and drove away in silence, he didn't go home. He drove for hours aimlessly, until he ended up at the house of the mother of the man who had been his lover. She knew him. She had worked with Laura before. And in that unexpected encounter, it was she who told him, with teary eyes, that her son had done this before. That it wasn't the first time. That there were women before Laura, all left behind when they wanted something more. And that he, Daniel, deserved someone who would choose him. That conversation, that revelation, was what stopped him from begging for explanations, from trying to fix what was already broken. It was then that he understood, when someone chooses to replace you, it's not your job to justify yourself. It's your job to get up and move on. The days that followed the reunion in the park were quietly transformative. Not because of what was said, but because of what was understood without words. Daniel returned home with a sense of closure that wasn't forced, but necessary. From that moment on, there was no more room for fantasies of reconciliation, nor for the resentments that bound him to the past. He had made a choice, to move on. And moving on meant respecting his own pain, but not chaining himself to it. The memory of Laura, of what she was and what she represented, was still present in many places, in objects, in habits, even in smells. But it no longer carried the weight of mourning. It came as a healed scar, no longer painful, but telling a story of survival. However, what Daniel didn't expect was what came next. Life, even when it seems stable, carries within it the unpredictability of emotions that haven't yet been fully worked through. Laura began to reach out to her daughter more intensely, more presently. She began to seek out all the spaces she'd previously neglected, trying to compensate for the emotional absence that had prevailed for so long. The girl responded well, but the deep connection she maintained with her father was still clear. It was to him she ran with her school drawings, it was from him she expected approval when she showed off her little accomplishments, it was with him that her laughter flowed most freely. Laura realized this with an inner tightness she couldn't name. It was regret, but it was also guilt. A guilt that made her wake in the middle of the night, sweating, dreaming of a home that no longer existed. Daniel, on the other hand, tried to balance his life with Helena without involving his daughter in any new, forced structure. He was careful with timing, space, and gestures. He knew the girl didn't yet understand everything, but she felt it. Children, contrary to what many think, have a refined sensitivity to what isn't said. And he made a point of keeping everything as clear as possible within the limits that childhood demands. Helena, in turn, respected every step. You knew that true love doesn't require haste. She observed, listened, participated when invited, but never occupied a space that wasn't naturally created. One day, while picking up his daughter from school, Daniel ran into Laura at the gate. It was the first time this had happened since the divorce was finalized. She looked at him with a mixture of discomfort and longing, and after a brief silence, she said she needed to talk. Not about custody, nor about the girl. She said it was something personal. Daniel hesitated, but out of consideration for their shared history, he agreed. They arranged to meet the following afternoon at a discreet cafe near their old apartment. He arrived first, as usual, and watched the people passing by on the sidewalk, reflecting on how life had changed, but without completely losing its essence. When Laura arrived, he noticed something was different about her. Not in her appearance, but in her posture. She sat down slowly, straightened her coat, and began by explaining that she had embarked on a profound internal process. She said she was in therapy, that she had read about emotional patterns, imbalanced relationships, and impulsive choices. She said she now understood, with painful clarity, that she had spent years trying to be validated by people and situations that had nothing real to offer. She said she had distanced herself from everything, the toxic environment of some colleagues, the friendships that fueled her insecurities, even the social media that forced her into constant, insane comparisons. Daniel listened without interrupting, but maintained a restrained posture. It wasn't disinterest. It was protectiveness. He had already given his all once, and now, he was learning not to dilute himself for anyone. Laura then looked him in the eye and said that, more than regret, she was ashamed. That she now saw how patient, generous, and loving he had been. And that, in her attempt to seek novelty, she had disregarded stability. That she had confused routine with boredom, and novelty with love. And that the result was an emptiness deeper than any loneliness she had ever felt. She said she knew he was with someone else. She said she didn't want to get in the way, but that she needed to ask for something: forgiveness. Not as a way to reopen doors, but as a way to leave something clean between them. Daniel took a deep breath, felt the impact of those words, and for a moment, he saw the woman he'd known in the past. The one who smiled lightly, who made pancakes on Sunday mornings, who danced in the kitchen when no one was looking. But now she was hurt. Not by him. By herself. And he knew that forgiving her would be more liberating for him than for her. He said, in a firm voice, that he forgave her. That he kept what was good and let go of what hurt. That he wanted her to be happy, even if far from him. He said that every choice carries weight, and that living is learning to bear them. Laura cried. Not because of forgiveness. But because of the certainty that love had died, and she only realized it now. After that encounter, something changed forever. Not just between them, but within each of them. Daniel allowed himself to delve deeper into his relationship with Helena. He began to open up previously closed spaces, sharing parts of his story that still hurt, revealing his vulnerabilities with the confidence of someone who no longer fears abandonment. Helena welcomed him without trying to fix things. She simply welcomed him. And that was all he needed. Over time, his daughter began to appreciate Helena's presence. With small, spontaneous gestures. A drawing here, a question there. And Daniel knew he was building something solid, based on respect. Laura, on the other hand, immersed herself in a solitary but honest process of rebuilding. She began attending support groups, read books on conscious relationships, and even revisited the idea of a professional transfer she had rejected in the past. She was determined to go, not to escape, but to truly start over. When she told Daniel, he simply smiled and said, "It will be good for you." She nodded, moved, and in that gesture, something inside her was released. Her attachment to what had been, to her guilt, to her desire to win him back. She finally understood that his forgiveness wasn't permission to return. It was a bridge for her to walk alone, with ease. The dilemma looming over everyone now was a different one: how do you rebuild a life when you have deep scars, but a true desire to be better? Each followed a different path, but carrying with them the marks of everything they'd experienced. And that's precisely what makes certain stories, even endings, remain alive in those who live them. Daniel learned that love isn't about staying at any cost. It's about knowing when to let go and move on. Laura learned that losing someone who truly loved you isn't a punishment. It's a consequence. What was to come wasn't the end yet. But it was the beginning of a new chapter for everyone. And it would be written with more conscious choices, with fewer impulses, with more truth. Because, in the end, love lost through carelessness almost never returns. But love built with patience and truth has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. And Daniel was now ready to live this new story. Daniel began to see the world through a new perspective. It was as if a cloudy lens had been removed, clearly revealing everything he'd previously only intuited: the small gestures that reveal so much, the silences that scream truths, the looks that hide entire stories. After forgiveness, the definitive conversation with Laura, and the emotional closure they both needed to leave the past where it belonged, the days began to flow again, but differently, with more lightness, with more awareness, with more truth. He no longer tried to fill silences or heal wounds with distractions. He began to listen to himself more. To respect his own limits. And this reflected in everything around him, including his relationship with Helena, which now took on clearer, more mature, and deeper contours. They no longer saw each other as two strangers trying to find common ground. Now there was a real bond, cultivated in calm, complicity, and the mutual choice to move forward together. Helena never sought to take up anyone's space. She simply walked beside him, and that was enough. Daniel, for his part, didn't seek in her what he'd lost with Laura. He didn't compare, he didn't idealize. He loved her for who she was, not what she remembered. And this was the kind of love he never knew existed until he experienced it. A serene love, one that didn't demand constant proof, nor begged for attention. It was a love made of presence, of listening, of hands that unhurriedly intertwined. One night, while they were having dinner at a new restaurant in town, Helena commented on something that echoed in Daniel's mind for days. Looking into his eyes, she said she deeply admired the way he handled everything with his daughter. It wasn't common to see someone so focused on affection without suffocating, so present without invading the girl's space. She trusts you in a way that's rare. You can see it in her eyes. You're her safe place, Daniel. That's bigger than anything, she said, a calm smile on her lips. He thanked her with a light squeeze across the table. But deep inside, something stirred. A sudden desire to offer his daughter a stable environment, an emotional structure that wasn't sustained solely by rotations of childcare, alternating weekends, and evasive phrases about the past. That week, Daniel spent more time reflecting than talking. He avoided impulsive decisions, but he couldn't ignore the growing desire to take new steps. He began to truly consider the idea of building a new family. Not a replacement for what had been, but a new story, with a different format, different foundations, a different rhythm. And for the first time since the divorce, she felt she could, indeed, be happy again within a home. She began renovating small rooms in the house, organizing her daughter's room with even more care, and incorporating small details she herself picked out on outings with him. Helena began to appear in more natural moments, with ease, without intruding. She was invited to Sunday lunches, picnics in the park, pizza nights, and movies with blankets on the couch. Laura, now living in another city due to the transfer she finally accepted, made sporadic visits. She had balanced the logistics of her daughter's visits with Daniel, and respected the established boundaries. On her first visit after the move, she stayed in the city for a few days, and it was inevitable to notice how much everything had changed. The house seemed different, the girl was more independent, calmer, and Daniel, despite his usual familiarity, seemed like someone new. She didn't comment, but she felt it. A bittersweet feeling washed over her. It was beautiful to see that he was okay, but it hurt to realize that she was no longer part of that picture. She had been replaced. Not by another woman, but by a new meaning, a new peace. And perhaps that was even harder to accept. On the last night of the visit, she asked to speak to Daniel, with her daughter already asleep. They sat on the porch, as they had before, with the streetlights flickering in the background and the muffled sound of cars in the distance. She began by saying she was happy to see her daughter doing so well. She missed some routines, but knew she needed to focus on herself now. Daniel just listened attentively. Then she took a deep breath and said she wanted to thank him. Not only for what you did for me while we were together, but for the man you continued to be, even after everything fell apart. You could have hated me, you could have pushed me away from our daughter, you could have exposed everything. But you were better than I deserved. Daniel stared at her for a few seconds and responded calmly. He said he'd done what needed to be done. That hating her would have been easy, but pointless. That his daughter deserved to grow up among healthy adults, not among hidden hurts. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears, and then asked something he hadn't expected, "Do you love her?" The question came honestly, without venom, without sarcasm. Daniel took a few seconds, but answered firmly, "Yes. But it's a different kind of love. Calm. Deep. And light. Something I've never experienced before." Laura smiled, even with her sad eyes. She said it was beautiful. And that he truly deserved it. The next morning, she left, promising to return the following month for another visit. Daniel hugged her respectfully, and his daughter waved with a smile from the gate. As the car turned the corner, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It was as if he were finally free. Free from the guilt, the doubts, the fear of making another mistake. Now, everything ahead was new. It was his alone. And he was ready to experience it fully. The following weeks were filled with more family moments. Helena was increasingly present, but always at the right pace. Until one Saturday afternoon, after a visit to the park, Daniel's daughter drew the three of them together. She, her father, and Helena. All holding hands, with hearts around them. She handed the drawing to him with a wide smile and said, "It's our new house, right, Daddy?" Daniel looked at the paper, then at Helena, who was in the kitchen preparing a snack, and then at the girl. He responded with a kiss on her forehead, "Yes, my love. Our new house." That night, Daniel went for a walk alone. He needed to think. Not out of doubt, but out of respect for the moment. He knew he was facing a choice that would change everything. And he felt there was no point in delaying. He returned home, waited for Helena to finish putting away the dishes, and asked to talk. They sat on the sofa, side by side. He held her hand, looked into her eyes, and told her he was ready. That he wanted to build a life with her. Not out of necessity, but out of love. That he wanted her to be by his side, by their daughter's side, through the good times and the hard times. Helena was silent for a few seconds, then smiled. She said she was ready too. That she felt this was the right path, even without guarantees. That she wanted to follow it with him. And in that moment, without grandiose promises, without rehearsed speeches, two hearts silently committed to starting over together. And there was still more to live. Daniel knew that, no matter how much the past was resolved, life would still bring new challenges. But now he felt he had someone by his side who would face everything with him. And that, more than anything else, was what he always wanted, someone who would stay. Who would choose to stay. Who would understand that love isn't just the beginning, but the maintenance. The daily choice. The constant care. Laura's past was now just a closed chapter. There was no hatred, no pain. There was only distance. A silent respect for something that had been important, but no longer made sense. And the future, finally, began to take shape. Not as an ideal, but as a real construction. Daniel had rebuilt himself. He had loved, been betrayed, forgiven, and now, he loved again. But with more clarity, with more awareness, with more strength. Because sometimes, it's precisely in the breaking that we find ourselves whole for the first time. Time passed with the same coldness with which the previous months had imposed so many transformations. But now, it no longer came as a relentless enemy, but as a silent ally, polishing the shards of what had once been pain and shaping something completely new. Daniel was living a different reality. Not a new version of the same story, but a completely different one, written with steady hands, open eyes, and maturity. Life now had rhythm. It had peace. It had purpose. Helen had become a solid presence. Not through time or insistence, but through consistency. The love she offered was calm but firm, and her every gesture showed that she was a woman who understood the responsibility of being by someone who had been truly hurt. She wasn't trying to erase the past. She knew it existed. But she helped to give it new meaning. And it was thus, little by little, that Daniel rediscovered the will to believe again. To love again. To live again. Her daughter was the link that held everything together even more. She was no longer a child completely oblivious to the emotions of adults. She felt. She perceived. But, contrary to what might have happened, she became more secure. More loving. More open. Seeing her father well, seeing that he remained steadfast and present, was what gave her structure. And seeing that Helena didn't compete with her mother for space, but simply created her own place in her heart, was fundamental for everything to flow more naturally. Daniel had built a home on ruins, but now that home was built on strong foundations. Although memories of the past returned from time to time, they no longer came as hauntings, but as memories that helped shape the man he was now. And that was enough. Laura, for her part, experienced both sides of regret. The first was internal. Silent. A slow process of facing herself without apology, of recognizing the choices she made not as mistakes, but as conscious decisions that had real consequences. She finally understood that what she destroyed wasn't just a relationship, but the trust, admiration, and image her own daughter held of her. And this weight was harder to bear than any loneliness. She spent sleepless nights, even in her new city, even after getting the promotion that had previously seemed unattainable. Her achievements no longer felt celebratory. Because now, everything she achieved was shared only with the echo of her own conscience. She made new friends, built a new cycle, but never again had the courage to truly give herself to someone. Not because she wasn't capable of love, but because she began to distrust herself. One winter afternoon, during one of the scheduled visits, Laura took her daughter for a walk in the old park where they used to go together. They sat on a bench that seemed smaller than she remembered, perhaps because of Daniel's absence. Her daughter mentioned a school performance, said Helena was going with her father, and asked if she wanted to go too. The invitation was made naturally, but Laura felt a pang in her chest. Not of jealousy, but of exclusion. She realized, then, how far she had distanced herself, not by imposition, but by choice. And now she had to live with the consequences. She went to the presentation. She sat in the back seats without making a fuss. She saw Helena arrive with Daniel and the girl, all holding hands. They smiled. They looked like family. A new family. And even though it hurt, Laura felt it was fair. Fair because Daniel chose the harder path. He didn't shut himself off. He didn't seek revenge. He didn't destroy. He just kept going. And that was the greatest act of strength she had ever witnessed. After the event, her daughter ran up to her, showed her the drawing she had made, and Laura hugged her tightly. Helena approached, and for the first time, the two looked at each other for more than a few seconds. Helena extended her hand, greeting politely. Laura returned it. There was something in that gesture that sealed the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Neither of them needed to be rivals. They both loved the same girl. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to build a respectful relationship. On the way home, Daniel walked alongside Helena and his daughter, and felt something different in the air. A real closure. A cycle that had finally closed. And it was that night, sitting next to the woman who now shared his days, and watching his daughter sleep with a slight smile on her face, that he made a decision. The next morning, he made breakfast, as he did on Sundays, and as he handed the mug to Helena, he looked into her eyes and told her he wanted her to stay. Not just as a visitor, not just as a partner. He wanted her to be a part of everything. Officially. He wanted her to know she didn't have to leave anymore. Helena, with tears in her eyes, replied that she was already there, body and soul. She just needed him to say it out loud. And there, without knees on the floor, without a ring in his pocket, but with their hearts exposed, they began to plan the life they would have together. Years passed. The girl grew up, strong, loving, respectful. She carried within her the sensitivity of someone who had seen pain but also witnessed overcoming it. In her high school graduation speech, she mentioned her father, the woman she chose to call her second mother, and even her biological mother, with affection and respect. She said she learned from each of them what it means to fail, forgive, and start over. And she said she hoped to love one day with the same courage she saw her father love again. Daniel watched from the audience with teary eyes and a calm heart. There was nothing left to prove. Everything was in its right place. Everything had followed the course it needed to follow. Laura watched the graduation video from afar, sent by her own daughter. She cried when she saw the speech. Not out of resentment, but out of gratitude. Because, despite everything, she hadn't lost her connection with her daughter. She'd built a different, yet sincere, relationship. And now, even from a distance, she knew her daughter was surrounded by love. And that was all that mattered. As for romantic love, Laura remained alone. Not for lack of opportunities, but by a personal choice. She felt she still needed to rediscover herself as a woman, as a person, before sharing her life with someone else. And although she still missed what she lost, now she also felt at peace with what she had learned. The end of that story wasn't the end of love. It was the birth of a more conscious, truer love. One that understood that cheating isn't just kissing someone else's mouth. It's breaking silent promises. It's tearing apart the trust that sustains bonds. And that, once done, one never goes back to the same place. Daniel wasn't a hero. Laura wasn't a villain. They were human. They failed, they learned, they moved on. And that's perhaps the most beautiful part of it all. Because life, with all its pain and ruptures, still offers new beginnings for those who have the courage not to wallow in their own mistakes. If you've listened to this story so far, comment below what you thought of this journey. What part touched you most? Which character resonated most with you? Your opinion is very important. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue following stories as intense and real as this one. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys homes, weakens bonds, breaks ties between parents and children, erodes trust, and leaves scars that not even time can completely erase. It's a poison that spreads silently, and once it's realized, there's no turning back. Here on the channel, we don't support, justify, or romanticize any form of betrayal. Our stories serve to reflect, to teach, and above all, to show that love needs to be nurtured with truth, respect, and conscious choices. Because those who love, don't betray. Those who love, build. And those who destroy, almost always lose everything.